everyone! Today we'll be exploring if ethnic minorities experience higher rates of depression and anxiety. We'll start by looking at patterns of anxiety and depression amongst ethnic minorities in the UK, introduce a multifactorial etiological model to understanding these disorders, define what being an ethnic minority means, and then we will move on to biological factors such as the HPA axis, cortisol stress response, and genetics. Next, we'll investigate psychological factors such as prevalence and risks, symptomatology, and situational stressors. Finally, we'll look at sociocultural factors such as socioeconomic status, urbanicity, social cohesion, racism, and stigma as barriers to help seeking. In terms of patterns of anxiety and depression amongst ethnic minority populations in the UK, findings from the Adult Psychiatry Morbidity Survey conducted in 2014 found 29% of Black women experience common mental health disorders, including generalized anxiety disorder and mild to severe depression. This is significantly higher than those from other ethnic groups. I've marked this here in purple. In terms of recovery from anxiety and depression, the highest percentage of patients showing an improvement was in the white British ethnic group at 68.1%, whereas the lowest percentage was in the Bangladeshi ethnic group at 60.8%. But what does this tell us? Why is there a disparity in who is recovering from symptoms of anxiety and depression? This can be attributed to barriers in help seeking and differences in exposure to various life stressors such as racism and urbanicity. We'll be looking at these further. In this presentation, we will look at depression and anxiety through a multifactorial etiological model. This is to better capture what ethnicity means for each person in terms of their mental health experiences. Defining ethnicity can be difficult as it refers to multiple factors of a person's identity. It can refer to long shared cultural experiences, ancestry, language, or national origins, for example, African, Caribbean, or Indian. All of these factors can interplay to influence a person's mental health. And secondly, to get a comprehensive perspective of the biopsychosocial factors affecting prevalence and incidence. Research into the etiology of depression and anxiety demonstrate interdependent factors such as the person's genetics, their pattern of thinking, social support, etc. can all play into their mental health presentation. First, we look at differences across ethnicities in HPA axis regulation and the cortisol stress response, followed by genetics research. In terms of the HPA axis and cortisol stress response, a study using cortisol samples found that ethnic minorities such as African Americans and Latinos tended to show flatter diurnal cortisol slopes than white adolescents. The studies attributed this to long-term exposure to perceived discrimination, as the HPA axis reacts powerfully to social and physical threats to well-being. However, the study found a very small effect size when comparing differences in diurnal slopes, and it did not define the characteristics of the type of discrimination. Another study obtained similar findings, where flattened diurnal cortisol slopes in ethnic minorities were observed at bedtime and reduced cortisol baseline at waking. Despite Hispanic and African American adolescents reporting higher levels of chronic social contextual adversities, such as low SES and single-parent households, they scored lower on hospital anxiety and depression scales, indicating lower levels of perceived stress. The study authors associated increased bedtime cortisol levels and reduced waking levels to a protective numbing mechanism as the body prepares itself for chronic stress-related elevations for the next day. However, it's so important to consider the long-term outcomes of long-term HPA axis dysregulation and the effect of numbed or reduced response to rewards on depressive symptoms. In terms of genetics, it's important to acknowledge that most research has been dominated by studies in high-income countries, especially with populations of European descent. As a result, most depression loci have been identified through homogeneous sample studies, affecting their generalizability to ethnic minorities. This is problematic as GWAS and candidate gene studies have shown there is heterogeneity in depression and anxiety genetics across different ancestries. Looking at candidate gene studies, one conducted on South Asian Nepali populations identified a prevalence of single nucleotide polymorphisms such as FKBP5 related to depression, which has been associated with altered function of the HPA axis. Studies on depressed individuals found Asian T allele carriers of GNBeta3CA25T appear to be more susceptible to depression. However, candidate gene studies limit the detection of potentially new disease pathways. For example, GNBeta3CA258 in depression was initially identified in high-income Western countries and then applied to other ethnic contexts. Also, candidate gene studies have small sample sizes compared to GWAS studies. In terms of GWAS studies, one conducted with African American and European ancestry depressed populations identified SNPs closest to ARN, TL2, which play an important role in circadian rhythm regulation, disturbances to which have been associated with maintenance of depression. You can see that here on the Manhattan plot for European ancestry on the red line of significance, but not in the African American ancestry plot below. However, numerous novel SNPs identified in the African American plot did not correlate with previous GWAS findings on European Caucasian populations. And you can see here how scattered these are on the African American ancestry Manhattan plot. And this reflects the sparsity of GWAS findings amongst ethnic minorities who are understudied. In terms of GWAS studies on anxiety, the STAR study looked at phenotypic and genotypic data from more than 17,000 US soldiers, including those of European, African, and Latino ancestry. They found SNPs within the CAM-KMT gene located in region 2P21, which I've marked in red, with anxiety disorders in European soldiers, but not in soldiers with African or Latino ancestry. The authors summarized that the attempt to extend the finding to other ancestry groups was met with limited success due to reduced power and genomic heterogeneity in the non-European groups. Next, we will look at psychological factors such as the presentation of anxiety and depression. We will do this through investigating the disease's prevalence and symptomatology, and then we will look at situational stressors. In terms of presentation, we'll go over prevalence of anxiety and depression first. Population-level large-scale longitudinal studies show that Black individuals report higher levels of anxiety than white individuals, and a meta-analysis of studies conducted in the UK found higher prevalence of depression amongst ethnic minority women, both in the Afro-Caribbean sample and in the Punjabi sample. Similarly, another meta-analysis of studies from both the UK and US indicated a slightly greater risk of depression amongst migrants and ethnic minority groups, with a risk ratio of 1.2. So not very high, but still there. As you can see on the forest plot on the right, the findings across studies are rather mixed. In contrast, a meta-analysis of epidemiological studies conducted in the community did not reveal higher rates of depression and anxiety in migrants and ethnic minorities in Western countries. Looking at symptomatology next, Hispanics and Asians were at an increased risk for worsened depressive symptoms compared to white populations. Similarly, qualitative studies have found elevated levels of psychological distress and anxiety symptoms in migrants and ethnic minorities. Another study found ethnic minorities were less likely to suffer from acute episodes of major depressive disorder than Caucasians. However, they are more likely to suffer from prolonged, chronic, and severely debilitating depression, affecting their daily functioning. In contrast, findings from a large multi-ethnic adolescent sample found white youth report significantly more depressive symptoms than Black and Hispanic adolescents. In terms of disease prevalence and symptomatology, findings appear to be mixed across systematic reviews and meta-analyses on the presentation. Most studies emphasize the importance of looking at the role of life stressors faced by ethnic minorities that worsen and maintain their experience of depression and anxiety. And so we will look at the impact of situational stress and perceived stressors on symptomatology. With regards to migration, Bosnian immigrants to the UK attributed their current diagnosis of depression to exposure to a high degree of social difficulties during the migration process, whereas with finances, depression in ethnic minorities has been associated with financial losses and household economic difficulties. When it comes to physical disabilities and comorbidity, anxiety disorders were more prevalent amongst ethnic minority women who were also diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, stomach or intestinal ulcers, or bronchitis. Lastly, in terms of experiences of racism and stigma, self-perceived racial discrimination in particular has been strongly associated with worsening anxiety symptoms. In our next section, we look at sociocultural factors such as socioeconomic status, urbanicity, social cohesion, racism, and stigma as a barrier to help seeking. In terms of socioeconomic status, structural disadvantages faced by ethnic minorities produce greater stress and consequently worsen depression and anxiety symptoms compared to their socially advantaged counterparts. Whereas a study found higher education and socioeconomic standing was associated with a lower risk of depression in African Americans, both male and female. However, low SES alone isn't a risk factor. The perception of one's socioeconomic status matters too. In a study investigating the prevalence of major depressive disorder with 1,117 black adolescents, 810 African Americans, and 360 Caribbean black people, high household income was set as the main predictor and major depressive disorder as the main outcome. They found higher household income was a protective factor against major depressive disorder only for Caribbean black men and women than for African American men. African American males were at a higher odds of developing lifetime, 12-month, and 30-day major depressive disorder. This study demonstrates how high SES fails to act as a protective factor for certain ethnic minority populations when it comes to chronic debilitating major depressive disorder. Urbanicity is a known risk factor for internalizing disorders such as anxiety and depression. Ethnic minorities are more likely to live in crowded and underserved urban housing with restricted access to green spaces and services. However, urbanicity is multifaceted and cannot be measured by a single integrated variable. For example, factors such as close social cohesion with neighbors were shown to reduce the prevalence of internalizing disorders, whereas factors such as overcrowding were shown to be risk factors for developing depression. In terms of social cohesion and support, experiences of social exclusion, stigmatization, and threat from one's close social circle were associated with depressive and social anxiety symptoms amongst ethnic minority youth. Low frequency of contacts with one's peer group and family were linked to emotional dissatisfaction and low reward perception. These subsequently predict the onset of depression. To better understand the effect of racism that ethnic minorities experience, we will look at a study that used data from 4 waves of the UK Household Longitudinal Survey. It found that exposure to racism or interactions with racial discrimination were linked to long-term negative effects on mental health, and 2 or more instances of racism were associated with common mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression, as recorded in the short-form health survey. As you can see on the table here, the distress scores were consistently higher for Black African respondents, whereas another study found self-perceived racial discrimination was strongly associated with worsening mental health, more so in African American women than men. Cultural and religious stigma around mental health disorders is particularly prevalent within ethnic minority communities, where seeking help can be looked down upon and discouraged. Stigma around discussing mental health with family and peers in ethnic minority communities has found to be associated with lower rates of recovery and help seeking at the primary care level. So what can we do as mental health practitioners to see people where they're at and relate to them better? We could try using the patient-centered, culturally sensitive healthcare model. This model was developed to help clinicians and providers in providing care and reducing disparities in treatment between minorities and non-minorities. Implementation of this model has been found to be associated with higher levels of patient satisfaction and adherence to treatment plans. Finally, we look at a summary of the implications and recommendations for future research. First, utilizing large sample sizes and investigating contextual factors such as systemic discrimination that might impact stress levels when investigating HPA axis and cortisol stress responses. Second, improving generalizability of findings from GWAS and candidate gene studies through expanding sampling pools to ethnic minority populations. Third, increasing gathering of qualitative and subjective accounts on differences in symptomatology and psychological stressors across ethnicities, as population-based data on prevalence and symptomatology tend to demonstrate mixed and conflicted findings. Fourth, looking at subjective perceptions of racism and socioeconomic standing, as these can impact mental health across ethnicities. Investigating policies to improve levels of overcrowding in underserved urban communities. Lastly, reducing stigma as a barrier to help seeking in ethnic minority communities through implementing the patient-centered, culturally sensitive healthcare model in improving patient satisfaction and reducing disparities at the primary care level. Here's a list of my references that I've used throughout the presentation. Thank you for listening.